Hello, my American Studies 340 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is week 3. Um, hope all of you had enjoyed that extra day of not being required necessarily to do stuff for this class or other classes. At least a somewhat restful Labor Day weekend. We're going into week 3, and we don't really have a whole lot of time off, really, other than weekends between now and um, really, there's a short midterm break where you get Friday off, but that's not relevant to our class. And then, really, you know, Thanksgiving time. So that's what, week 13 or 14. So, best to pace yourself. So, few things in order. First, thank you all of you for, who did your reflections for the first week. I went through those and put commentary and feedback on all of them for on Saturday actually. So I finished all of that Saturday. Most of you did fairly well to really well to excellently on this. And just to reiterate, I said this before, but I want to say this again. Reflections on the paper. It's basically a combination of self-reflection and personal reflection, how you're reacting to the readings and other materials, how they're informing you as a person and as a student of the history of race and education and how it relates to the contemporary terms of K-12, K-16, other kinds of formal education in the United States. So in 2020, the contemporary sorts of issues. So very good overall. I'd say pretty good to very good overall. So thank you for that. For those of you who joined the class after the first week in particular, or had trouble joining the class first week or two, which is now registered, the assignment does not apply to you. You were not really in the class the first week or two, so you're excused essentially from doing the first reflection. So there's no real issue there for you. For those of you who were in the class the first 2 weeks and didn't do the assignment, then you might want to talk to me one-on-one about the assignment and what you might want to do to make it up or what have you, right? But that's up to you. It's ungraded, but I do have to calculate your grade at some point. So it counts in the sense that I have to think about your grade holistically, but you don't have a specific grade on it. And that will continue for everything other than discussion throughout the rest of the course. Okay, you have a paper due a week from this coming Sunday, so that would be September the 20th, I think. Yeah, the September the 20th. I will put together a list of questions to pick from for doing that paper by the time either by Thursday or Friday, so that you have it for more than a week in advance. 4 to 6 page paper. You're going to be commenting on some of these readings, but in a more analytical sort of way where you're making some sort of argument, you're trying to answer a question, you're trying to use evidence to show what you've read and know from the readings, and then do analysis of that. So that's different. That's a regular sort of term paper assignment as opposed to doing a reflection. So I just want to make sure that I reiterate all of that. And then third, before I go into what we're talking about today, for this week, is trying to figure out what organizations or entities you'd like to work with in the course of doing your research project, or whether you want to do it one-on-one or with someone else in the class. We need to start beginning to think more seriously about this, and I've given you some indicators in terms of these are organizations that the community-based community service learning folks have a list of for the DC area. If you're outside of DC, you probably want to work within your local context because it might be easier to do something virtually that way than reaching randomly across the country to do something. But either way, you need to go through the syllabus. There's a whole section of syllabus that talks about different topics and different entities that you might want to work with. Please look at this. I do not want this to turn into something onerous, and I don't want it to turn into something where it is week 5 or 6, and I'm expecting you to put together a proposal, and you don't have anything because you haven't connected with an organization, you haven't decided to do volunteer work, you haven't decided to reach out and say, hey, I want to do research on X, and I want to work with this organization or entity to do it, and you haven't, you know, applied for a job somewhere where you could do this part-time. It's only 20 hours. You're going to have to do the work anyway in terms of your research project. So 20 hours is 20 hours. However that 20 hours is spent, you can figure out any number of ways around it. Like I said, if you need more material from me to help you jumpstart this, I'm more than happy to do that. Um, so I'm going to use that to segue into this week's sort of summary for the readings and materials for this week. This week is about the story of segregated education and efforts to eradicate it, sort of the mid to late 20th century. So that gets us closer to where we are today. You know, the first 2 weeks are really about getting grounded in the reality that racism and systemic racism is part and parcel of the history of American education in the United States, right? Whether you are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, or Latino, Latina, or Asian, or someone who's non-white, and certainly non-WASP, you've experienced some form of some sort of race-based discrimination within the confines of K-16 schooling, particularly K-12. Um, as a form of social control, as a means to assimilate people, as a means to segregate people. This next 2 week segment's really about um, trying to deal with the segregation part of this, particularly for African Americans. Although some of this stuff also applies to Native Americans and Latinx and Asian um, Americans as well, to the extent that assimilation is taking place for these folks without being around um, white students for the most part. And if they are around white students, it's they're certainly are not being educated by people who look like them. Indigenous folks are generally being educated by folks who are white. Same with Asian kids when they're in public school. Same with Latinx folks when they're in public school. For the most part, they're seeing white teachers teaching them how to be Americanized. It is a form of segregation, albeit more cultural segregation than physical segregation that African Americans faced. So your readings for week 3 and week 4 are in tandem around the story of the segregation and desegregation, a process that led to the end of legal segregation of public schools in the United States, which is known formally as the Brown decision of 1954, probably the biggest Supreme Court decision in history, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, and it was through the use of separate but equal education, or separate but equal systems of education that were anything but separate and equal, right? What makes the Brown decision particularly critical, by the way, is the fact that the schools that were involved, the school districts that are involved in the Brown decision, particularly Topeka, Kansas, and Wilmington, Delaware, and Richmond, Virginia, and a couple of other places, and then of course the corresponding case, which is Bowling v. Sharp. I'll say that again, Bowling v. Sharp, which is the Supreme Court decision that specifically involved D.C. public schools. All 5 school districts involved in the culminating decision that is called Brown had equal funding. In fact, Black teachers in those school districts were paid exactly the same as white teachers. They had equal funding. There was nothing around the physical plants that was that different between the all white portions of the schools in Topeka, Kansas, and the all black schools. They might have had older textbooks in DC public schools, but they would have been so much older that they were out of date, right? They, same thing with, with Wilmington, Delaware, same thing with Topeka, Kansas, and other parts of the folks that are involved in the decision of 1954. So there's that part to it, that main part. But within that, I'm trying to also give you some flavor for the variety of things and strategies that people are kind of trying to come up with to deal with segregation on the basis of race and other dimensions. There's an Almeida article in The Hidden Half, a history of Native American women's education, because quite frankly, no one talks about Native American women for the most part, and how they dealt with boarding schools and how they resisted some of these changes, some of this assimilation, some of this segregation of their education as well. There's Randall Kennedy, who gives a more clinical legal approach to what happened in the years after Brown. There's how Brown was essentially whittled down over time, and this gradual approach to desegregating public schools ultimately hasn't worked. There's my own book, Fear of a Black American. You have a chapter from that to read, which goes over what happened specifically in DC public schools, the process for ending segregation in DC public schools, and how that process of ending it didn't really take care of many of the problems that existed in DC public schools, especially with white reactions to the end of segregation in DC, including in public schools. So you're getting a variety of reads around the story of segregated education and what, and efforts to try to deal with that to get rid of segregation. Now, how does that compare to doing this in the contemporary? I'm trying to give you a historical analysis, but also at the same time trying to take this into the contemporary too. And I'll use my own background as an example as a researcher and as someone who had to do work with Pittsburgh Public Schools. My senior year of college, I worked with a professor by the name of Barbara Sizemore, who used to be the superintendent of DC Public Schools back in the early 1970s. She came in at a time where DC Public Schools was in shambles in terms of overcrowdedness, overcrowding in certain parts of the district versus undercrowding in other parts, because while legal segregation was over, there was still residential segregation between mostly white Northwest DC, and, well, becoming mostly black, but higher proportion of white people living in Northwest DC, particularly Ward 3, which happens to be where Tinleytown is located, versus wards 6, 7, and 8, high concentration of African Americans, probably 99% African American, and having various issues there. She'd done that work for a number of years before going to University of Pittsburgh. I worked with her to work on the project that looked specifically at the resegregation of desegregated schools through magnet programs. It was of interest to me because I am someone who went through a magnet program from all through middle school and all through high school in order to, go to college, right? So here I'm in college a few years after graduating from a magnet program in Mount Vernon, New York, which is right outside New York City, by the way. And I wanted to take a closer look at these magnet programs and how you could have segregation of resources and opportunities and of bodies within a school. And so that meant me writing, at the time, making phone calls, and writing the occasional email to folks, and literally writing up questions going, I have a set of questions I need to ask this principal. I have a set of questions I need to ask this teacher. I need to spend time observing these classrooms and seeing what the demographics of these magnet classrooms are at Shinley High School and at Peabody High School and at Alderdice High School. These were the various high schools in Pittsburgh that had magnet programs that were disproportionately white compared to regular track programs within the school buildings themselves. Forget about if I went to Westinghouse High School in Homewood, which is predominantly black, or I went to another high school in the area that would have been in the Hill District that would have been predominantly black, and those schools would have been 99% black. They might not have even had a magnet program, which meant lack of advanced courses and lack of opportunity for black students in those high schools to take such courses. So that's what I did, and it was a process. She sat us down. She didn't literally sit down to tell us how to write up questions. She didn't sit down to tell us how to make phone calls. It was assumed that we knew how to make a phone call and ask a principal to be able to go to the school or contact the superintendent's office, find the assistant superintendent that dealt with curriculum instruction, and ask them, "Hey, can I observe a magnet class at Shinley High School in progress?" It was, and what she would do though, she would look over the questions that you might want to ask, and make sure that you were asking the same question to an assistant principal at Shinley or assistant principal at Alderdice, or a teacher who's teaching calculus in the magnet program at Alderdice versus somewhere else in Shinley or somewhere else at Peabody or somewhere else at another school. I ended up doing four high schools and all. And I guarantee you the whole project, prep time and actual time in the classroom, I probably spent 4 hours total time in classrooms. I spent another probably 2 hours interviewing people. Most of the time that I spent developing these research questions for my research project was all the prep work. It wasn't the actual time, right? So I don't want you getting all concerned about doing this kind of work and thinking, oh my God, I got to figure out this organization. I got to figure out this. I got to figure out that. It's one step at a time. The first thing you want to figure out is what question you want to ask and who you want to ask those questions to. And that's hard to do if you don't have an organization in place. And I bring up the whole thing around segregation, resegregation, because it's a big topic. It was too big a topic for me to even try to take on as a senior. Even though I already had a grad course, and a grad level course by the time I took this project on, it was too big a question. And doing 4 classrooms at 4 different high schools over the course of 6 hours and a bunch of interviews still really wasn't enough to do something that would have been worthwhile necessarily, but it was a beginning of the process, a beginning of the process to try to learn more about resegregation of public schools, of which we have tons of research on now. So I'm just giving this you as an example, considering the nature of what we're talking about this week and next week, to really begin to think about what is the it that you're interested in, and who are the entities that you're interested in, and doing this research with. Through your work, through volunteer work, through actually getting a job, through just, contacting them and touching up with them, right? Touching base with these folks. So you need to start that process, begin that process really this week, ideally between now and the end of week 4, so that by the time we get to week 6 and start talking about where's your where's your where's your where's your proposal at, you'll have something to give me, and not be, oh, I don't know, Professor Collins. So that's pretty much it. I just want to make sure that you're aware that we're not just taking on these questions for the sake of taking them on. These questions also have our value in terms of doing your research project, because these are all big topics. So that's it for this week. Again, you'll get your paper assignment questions probably no later than Friday afternoon. Ideally, probably by the time we start class Thursday evening. So you'll have those in the next couple of days. That's it. See you all on Thursday.